Well, good morning and welcome to Salem Grace. Hopefully you are glad to be here. I know we've got a lot going on at Salem Grace, hence the little commercials that you just watched, but there's a lot of things that are happening right now and getting kicked off in the fall, and we love this time of the year because kids are back to school and we start Crave and our Grace Extreme and our Youth Loop and all of this great stuff, grow groups and starting point, all this great stuff starts happening around this place. And if you're not a part of any of that, we encourage you to do so, and especially our grow groups. And I know we have a lot of discussion and staff meetings and even around the church around grow groups. And we look across this. I look across this this auditorium here this morning, and I realize that not everybody's in a grow group, and for some people that's awkward. They're like, I don't really know how to get in one. I don't really know. I don't want somebody to put me in one. I don't want to go to somebody's house and be like freaked out or have somebody else freaked out by me. And so there's an insert in your bulletin. There's a lot of ways that you guys can get involved in a grow group and if you're not ready for that grow group, we would encourage you to jump into the starting point class. It's a class that'll start. Yours truly teaches it, and then it's really just a conversation about God. It's not intimidating whatsoever, and so we'd encourage you to do that. There's a couple ways you can do that. You can sign up, you can fill out the thing, or stop by the Got Questions table, or you can get online or on our Facebook page, right, Shalala? And then you can click and sign on there, and we'll help you get engaged. And we really strongly encourage. I'm just a firm believer that we need each other, and we need that group setting, and we need individuals that are pouring into our lives, and you need to have that environment where you can actually pour into other people's lives. So just exciting. It's great to be a part of those groups, and if you haven't done so, then you're missing out, and we encourage you to do that. But we're in the second week of a series called Don't Stop, and last week I spent a lot of time talking about Don't Stop on 6, and we talked about the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho and how he marched around the city 6 times, and then on the 7th time, really, God did something amazing. And so we talked last week about not stopping on 6 and not stopping on the 6th lap. Is anybody here did anybody go an extra lap this week? Anybody just say, hey, I'm going to stick it out? Okay, great, nobody. That's awesome. I'm going to go back in just my notes and re-preach last week's sermon. There's a scripture in Romans 8:28, and it says, and we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. And so this week, we're going to be looking at a story out of the New Testament, but I wanted to remind you there's always an anchor verse when you do a series, and a verse that I shared last week that I want to reiterate this week, and it's in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 36, and it says, you need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what he has promised. And we talked a little bit about that last week, about how we want what God has promised, but sometimes we want it right now, and it's difficult for us to persevere and to endure things, to wait for that prize. And we talked last week about these guys marching day after day after day around this city of Jericho, and then, not knowing if it was going to be 1 day or 2 days or 3 months or 6 months until God delivered the promised land to them and what he had promised. But we have to persevere. You need to persevere in all that you've done so that the will of God, so you'll receive what God has promised. And so basically what this verse is telling us is that we tend to give up too quickly. We quit too quickly. We need to persevere. If we lose 10 pounds, then we're good. Or if we quit doing cardio. If we don't, if we're not like an Olympic sprinter by the 1 week, then we're like, okay, well, this isn't working out. I'm giving this up, or whatever it is. Golf. Now there is a sport to quit. I think that's actually somewhere in the Bible. It says, "Thou shalt be okay to quit golf before you lose your mind and break stuff," because that's what happens to me. And so golf is one of those appendages that I have chosen to cut off because it causes me to sin. So I just whack it off, and it's if you saw my golf game, you'd know why. But we talked about starting and stopping things, and I think what's interesting is we are typically, and I don't know if you find this true or if it's just me, but we are more impressed with people who have the fortitude to finish something more so than we are impressed with people who have the courage to start something. Have you ever noticed that? Let me read that again. We are more impressed with people who have the fortitude to finish something than we are with people who have the faith to start something. Because a lot of us can start stuff, right? A lot of us start junk. And I asked for permission. I sent Kevin Green a text this week, and I don't know if you guys know Kevin Green. He's our Salem high school football coach, and he gave me permission to use him as an example. But over the past couple of years, I've gotten to know Kevin, and he has kids that are my son's age, and so Kevin does over the past couple of years, he has done a half marathon or a half Ironman. This year, Kevin will do a full Ironman. So if some of you guys don't know what that is, let me just tell you what that is. It's a triathlon event where you do consecutively a 2.4 mile swim. Then you get out of the pool after swimming 2.4 miles, and you ride a bike for 112 miles. That's like from here to Champaign. You ride a bike 112 miles, and then you get off of the bike, and you run a full marathon, which is 26.2 miles. I can't run to the mailbox. The mail, I'm getting the mail. Ran down here. I can't do it. I'm impressed by that. That, and that's not something you just roll out of bed and go, you know what, I think I'll do an Ironman today. You don't just roll out of bed and, swim and bike from here to Champaign and then run a marathon. I'm impressed by that. He's going to start that. So I'm impressed that he's going to start that, but he has the fortitude to finish this, and he's been putting the work in all summer. Like, you'll see him through town, like, ride. Sometimes I'll pass him on Sunday morning when it's actually his time to bike, and he'll be biking or running. I see him all over the place, but he's preparing, and he's persevering to accomplish this race, and I just think it's awesome. But we're more impressed with people who have the fortitude. I'm just actually privileged to know him. like that's as close to the Ironman as I'm going to get. As somebody else that I know did one once. That's as close as I'm going to get. I have no desire. But this week I want to talk to you about what God's purpose is in your life. And so the title of today's message is really, It Will Happen. And so I want to talk to you about that. And I want to talk to you about a story that we pick up in the 27th chapter of Acts. And it's really Paul who is in the 27th, when you look in the 27th chapter of Acts, you read a story about Paul who is actually on board a ship. And let me just clarify a few things before we jump into this story. But it says there's some things I think we need to understand about Paul in this story. And what we need to understand is that for Paul to write and share some of the things that he wrote, it came through difficult places. For him to be able to write about the depths and the riches of Christ, he had to experience some personal depths of pain and disappointment. And we pick up that story in the last part of Acts, and the long and short of it is that Paul is in trouble. He is like in a world of trouble. He's a prisoner on board of a ship headed to Rome, and Paul's aboard this ship. It's not like Carnival Cruise Line or the Princess whatever. It's the Princess Cruise Line. This is not a pleasure cruise to Rome. Okay? It is not fun. He is bound hand and foot with a bunch of other prisoners and slaves on board this nasty ship with God knows what kind of conditions there are, and I'm talking probably a little bit more than bed bugs. They probably even have beds. They're just in the hull of this ship and traveling to Rome, and that's where we pick this story up in Acts chapter 27, and I want to walk through this. There's a lot of verses this morning that we're going to walk through, so hang with me. But we pick it up in Acts 27, verse 9 and 10, and it says this: We had lost a lot of time. The weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was late in the fall, so probably getting close to the time that we are, and Paul spoke to the ship's officers about it. Verse 10, he says, "Men," he said, "I believe there is trouble ahead if we go on. Shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well." And so here's a couple of things I want to point about this. They're in a bad shape. They're on this ship. The seas are starting to get rough. It's not looking good. And don't you love the fortitude of Paul to be able to stand up? And he's a prisoner, for crying out loud, on the ship. And he's like, okay, somebody's got to say something. We're going to die here. This is getting ugly. This is getting bad. And so Paul stands up. And so he begins, and I love that. He begins to stand up and says, "Hey, fellas, let's talk about what's going on here. The conditions were not ideal to be on the ship on the water at that point in time, and Paul knew it. And I just wonder how many times and how many of us are going through situations in our life where our situation is not ideal. It's not good. And probably it's getting worse. Day after day after day. And the longer we stay out here, it's just getting worse. And I think sometimes our lives are like that. Our situations are not ideal. But Paul he's the voice of reason and love, and I love that Paul has to stand, and he stood up when it would have been difficult to say, and he is a slave and a prisoner on this ship. Why does he think that any of the ship captain or the centurions on the ship would listen to him? But he stands up and he says, hey, verse 10, men, he said, I believe we're in trouble. Hey, over here, we're in trouble. I think we're headed for some danger here if we don't do something different. And I love the voice of reason here. And sometimes I need that in my life. I need people that will speak to voice of reason in my life. People that will say, hey, you know what, this is probably not good. And one of those people that, is interesting, and I give her a hard time about it, and I asked her permission too. I'm not picking on her. But Lindsay Heinzman, I don't know if you know Lindsay, but Lindsay, we went to Big Stuff, and she is like super hypochondriac. And she sent me, in all seriousness, she sent me a note before Big Stuff on Facebook and said, hey, I'm really worried about this. And it was an article on a brain-eating amoeba that was in the water. And I just had to laugh. And then also Nikki Rexilius, when we go to Big Stuff, Nikki, last year, Nikki came to me and said, hey, she was scared to come to me, so she went to Cheryl and said, hey, will you tell Trent to talk to the kids about the sharks? I was like, are you serious? And Cheryl's like, well, I'll tell him, but he'll probably laugh. And I did. It's just like, I don't think about that stuff. It doesn't worry. I just wait out. You just go. I don't think about it. Some people are like, yeah, you should take talking about that. Some kid's not going to be able to go next year because of that. But there's this voice of reason. There are people that talk to your life. But Acts chapter 27:11 says this, but the officer in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and to the owner than to Paul, right? So Paul stood up and says, hey, we're in a bad way here. We're headed in a bad direction. Situations are not ideal. And the ship's captain, the centurion listened, or the officer in charge of the prisoners said, hey, thanks, Paul, for your recommendation. Sit down and shut up. I don't work for you, pretty much. But there's a couple of things. Obviously, that makes sense, right? Obviously, that makes sense. If you're in charge of getting prisoners on this boat to Rome, and you're employed by people who own the boat, and there is a captain of the boat, you're not going to listen to one of the prisoners, right? It makes no sense to do that. It makes absolutely no sense to listen to Paul. He's bound hand and feet, and he's like, hey, we're headed for trouble here. And so he's like, yeah, hey, thanks for your suggestion, but you can just sit down. And so Paul, here's the thing. Paul says, he goes, no, you don't listen. If you read the story, he's like, the Lord told me. And isn't that interesting about like Christians? That's like our Christian trump card. Have you ever noticed that? No, the Lord told me to do this. And then we can do whatever we want. It's like, no, God told me. Well, how do you argue with that, right? And so Paul is wrestling with this guy and saying, hey, so here's a couple metaphors for our life that I want to call out to you. Paul is more than a prisoner or a passenger on this boat, and we're going to pull all this together, so stay with me. He represents on this boat God's purpose. He represents God's purpose. God is speaking through Paul to save those men. But here's the thing, and here's what happens. So often we listen to the other voices on the boat, and we listen to everyone else's assessment of our situation before we listen to what God has to say in our lives. I think so many times many of us are going through situations in our lives, and we talk to our friends, hey, what do you think I should do? Hey, what do you think I should do? And we listen to all the other voices, all the other people that are speaking into our ear and telling us what we should do and how we should behave and what we should do, and we're not listening to the voice of God that's in our lives. And Paul represents that in this story. He's the voice of God. He's the voice of reason. He's the voice that says, hey, listen, if you don't stop this, if you don't turn around, if you don't change this in your life, it's going to be bad. What are you listening to this morning? Who are you listening to in your situations in your life? Are you listening to your friends? Are you listening to other people that are telling you how to live? We need to listen to the voice of God and what he has to say for us in our life. And the ship, what does it represent? It represents your life, or even the church for that matter. Because the ship, every ship is being steered by something. Every ship is being steered or directed in some direction. The ship represents the direction that each one of you and all of us are headed. We are the ship, or this church, if that matters, a body of believers. We represent that ship. So what's guiding it? So naturally, Paul, when he stands up, the centurion or the guy that's in charge, he says, you know what, that makes absolutely no sense, Paul. I'm not going to listen to you. I'm not going to listen. Because sometimes, have you ever noticed that when God tells you to do something, sometimes it makes absolutely zero sense? I don't know if you've ever noticed that. Some of the things, maybe you've never felt God's presence in your life, but God may be asking some of you to do something today that makes absolutely zero sense to you. The Bible, if you read through the Bible, it's full of stories where God made absolutely no sense. Joshua, we talked about a story last week. Joshua, here's what I want you to do. I want you to march around the city 7 times, six times, blow your horns, nobody say anything. Thanks, God, it makes a lot of sense. Appreciate that. Look at Noah. Hey, Noah, here's the deal. I know it's never rained, but I'd like for you to build this giant boat. Thanks, God. Makes a lot of sense. Read through it. Moses, Moses, here's what I'm going to do. I know the Egyptian army is going to be chasing you, and they're going to have chariots and horses and all this stuff, and when you're going to come to the Red Sea, and it's going to be impassable, and so here's what I want you to do. I want you to take your stick out, and I want you to touch the water. That'll do it. Pretty confident. I'm sure Moses had to be going, okay, whatever. But here's the thing. None of that makes sense, and I think sometimes, here's the thing. If you live... We have a tendency, humanly, to want to make sense out of things in our own world. We want to make sense out of God. And just like the centurion, nothing makes sense. Here's the thing. If we live our lives by what makes sense, you will never be a person of strong faith. I'm going to challenge you that this morning. If you stop every time something doesn't make sense in your walk with Christ, you're never going to be a person of strong faith. Thinking, and here's the voices we hear. It's like, you know what? This is going to cost me a little bit of money. If I do that, God, it's going to cost me. If I take that kid in, if I choose to be a foster parent, how am I going to pay for that? If I choose to invite these kids into my house, how am I going to pay for that? If I choose to be, as a church, if we choose to make some changes so that we can reach this community, it might cost us a little bit of money. But sometimes it doesn't make sense. My friends will make fun of me. People are going to think I'm weird. People are going to call me one of those Christians. So my question to you this morning is, are you living according to your senses, what you can calculate, or are you living according to a sense of confidence in what God has promised? Using God's math. It's kind of like the Common Core stuff. You ever see that? The Common Core math, It's like 2 + 2, but then you got to do this whole big old thing. It makes absolutely no sense. Takes you twice as long. God's math is kind of like that. Makes no sense. Take you twice as long. Here's the thing. Outcome is God's responsibility. Obedience is ours. We just have to be obedient. You don't have to understand to obey. You ever feel like you're making progress? Have you ever done that? Anybody ever felt like you're making progress with something and trying to fix something, and you feel like, okay, it's getting good, and you just keep going and keep going and keep going. You just keep doing something over and over, then you realize that you forgot something or thought you could take a shortcut and then find out that you just made it worse. I had a friend once, we were painting. We worked for a paint contractor up by Chicago, and we had painted this guy's house, but we had to come back and finish. The house was finished, the guy was living in the house. And so we had to go finish his bay window. He had this bay window and it wasn't stained yet. And so we had to go in there and do that and do some other touch-up work. Guy was home, big guy, was home, and he had this beautiful home up South Chicago. We went in there, and a buddy of mine, he's like, hey, I'll stain the window. And we're like, okay, knock yourself out, which we should have known. He always made a mess everywhere he went. And like he came, it was like a cherry stain, and the carpet was like as white as these tablecloths. It was so white. It's like snow white carpet. And so this cherry stain, and he gets a drop, like a quarter-size drop of that stain on the carpet right in front of the bay window. And we were like, oh, dude. Because it's oil-based stain. It's not like it's not going to just clean right up. And it was like, and so he's like, no, I got it. No, don't say anything. He's like whispering, he's like panicking. And so next thing I know, I see him with a jug of paint thinner. I'm like, oh no, this is going to be bad. This is going to be really bad. And I went in and checked on him. We're like, oh dude, you're on your own. And we just like scattered. And then like, I don't know, 5 minutes later or something, we come in to check on his progress. And that stain that was this big, it was like 5 feet. It was so big. Like he was in there, and he was like going like blah, blah, blah. I was like, that can't be good for the carpet. And he was just in a panic. He was just absolutely in a panic. And the more he worked on that stain, the bigger it got. It was ginormous. I kid you not. It was like 5 feet by 5 feet wide. I was like, that is horrible. Good luck, buddy. It's coming out of your check. It was so bad, and the guy, the homeowner was there while we did it, and he came in and was just flipped out. But he managed actually to get, it was just a big mess. But the point is, I think sometimes that's our lives. We have something that's small, and we think we're making progress with it. We think we're doing it on our own. We can fix this. I can make this work. We can make this work. And there's a thing in psychology, some of you don't know, I have a degree in psychology. Who knew, right? Worked at a bank, came in handy. There's a thing in psychology called a control paradox. And it means that the harder you try, the less control you have. It's a control paradox. And I think that's kind of where they were here. That's where these guys were. And if you look in Acts chapter 27, verse 13, it says this. It keeps on going. When a light wind began blowing from the south, the sailors thought they could make it. So they pulled up an anchor and sailed close to the shore of Crete. And in this passage, we see men that kept on sailing. And I know we're in a sermon series called Don't Stop. But if there was ever a situation they should have stopped, it should have been right there. Paul should have said, hey, this isn't good. Don't keep going. This is going to be bad. But they kept going. Verse 14. But the weather changed abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength called a nor'easter burst across the island and blew us out to sea. And I think sometimes in our life we feel like we're making progress. And we feel like we're getting along. But even the progress that you're making is ultimately leading to your disaster. It may feel like the wind is at your back, but ultimately it's leading us to disaster. Verse 16, Matthew 16:26 says this, and what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? I think some of us are chasing after careers. We're chasing after money. We're chasing after relationships. And it feels like we're making progress in our life. Feels like we're getting ahead of the game, maybe. When in reality, we're sailing straight for disaster. Because we've not come to a place where we've truly 100% committed our life to Jesus Christ. We're just being driven along. And that's what you see a picture here in verse 15. It says, the sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, and so they gave up and let it run before the gale. We're just being driven along, going with the flow, completely out of control. And I wonder how many times of our lives are like that. We really don't have any direction. We're really not seeking God's direction in our life. We're just letting the ship run wild. We've given up. And maybe there's some of you in a situation that is so messed up that you've just given up. Verse 17, Then the sailors bound ropes around the hull of the ship to strengthen it. They were afraid of being driven across the sandbars of Syrtis off the African coast. And so they lowered the sea anchor to slow the ship, but were driven before the wind. They've completely floating aimlessly and dangerously through life with absolutely no direction because they've chosen to ignore the warning signs and stop doing what they're doing. And here's the thing, I think probably I could point out some things that all of us are doing in our lives spiritually. We're ignoring some of the warning signs. But I'm not going to do that because God does that to you himself. He doesn't threaten us. He doesn't condemn you. But this morning there may be that gentle whisper in your ear that says, hey, you need to get that piece back on track in your life. You're floating aimlessly without direction, and it's going to be headed for disaster if you don't get that fixed. He doesn't condemn us. It's just that still small voice. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with those things in our life when things are out of control and we're in the middle of the storm and we are fighting the battle? And here's what these guys did. Verse 18 and 19 says this. The next day, as the gale force winds continued to batter the ship, the crew began throwing the cargo overboard. The following day, they even took some of the ship's gear and threw it overboard. And I believe some of us are like that. You're just throwing stuff off and trying this and you're trying that and you're listening to different people and you're doing whatever else that person told you to do and you're trying whatever you can try to make it fix the problem that's in your life, and you're just chucking stuff overboard hoping that it's going to help and just praying that that's going to help and you're going to get your ship righted and things are going to start working out in your life because you're just trying whatever comes along. You're just chucking stuff off. You're in the middle of trouble, trials, or situations, and situations that many of you, honestly, have created yourself. Isn't that true sometimes? We get ourselves in a situation where we're like, God, why did you? And it's really situations of our own making because we didn't listen to somebody else years ago that said, hey, don't do that. And we said, I don't care, I'm going to do it anyway. And now we're in the middle of a situation that's messed up. And when we're trying everything, we're scratching at everything. We're trying anything to salvage our life, your marriage, your relationship, your reputation, your friends, your dreams, your career goals. You're just scratching and clawing and trying everything you can to make it work. Chucking stuff overboard. But you know what happens? The storm just keeps coming. You ever notice that? Have you ever noticed that when you're in the middle of something, I can't tell you the number of people that I talk to on a weekly basis that says, man, I wish I could just catch a break. I wish I could just catch a break. It just keeps coming. It just keeps pounding. Things just keep getting worse. How can it get any worse than what it is right now? It's exactly where Paul found himself in verse 20. The terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars until at last all hope was gone. I underline that. Have you ever reached that point in your life? You're wrestling with something that's just so agonizing. Maybe you've lost something. And you've given up hope. And what happens is when you reach that point, when the storms just keep coming, we move from distress to despair. And here's the difference between distress and despair. You want to know the difference? Distress is I'm throwing stuff overboard, trying to make it work. Despair, it says, oh crap, we're going to die. Distress is, let's throw some stuff overboard and wrap some ropes around this thing and try to tie it together. And despair is like, well, you know what? Forget it. We're at the wit's end. We're not going to make it out of this alive. which is where these guys were at. We reach a point where we feel that things will absolutely never get better. We're not going to be healed. This marriage is never going to be repaired. I'm going to always be single. I'm going to always have this addiction. I'm always going to be overweight. I'm always going to struggle financially. This is always going to get the best of me. And we reach a point in our life where we just throw our hands up and the sun has been blotted out for days and we can't see anywhere where we're going, and we just throw it up and say, you know what? Whatever. The thing about this, as long as they could see where they were going, they kept plugging along. But eventually, they lost sight of the sun. It had been dark for so many, they didn't know which direction they were heading. My dad had a saying one time, he would always say this, he still says it today. He would always, and I'd get these little, my dad used to send me when I was in college, he'd send me a prayerogram. It was like a little thing, and it said prayerogram. And sometimes it would say, he would have some little funny rhyme on there, you know, like, sorry, son, no mun for some fun, you know, something like that. Knew what that meant, thanks. But he always would write on there, keep the sun in your eyes. S-O-N, not S-U-N. Keep the sun in your eyes. Because he knew that if we had that directing the ship, if you could see the sun, everything else is going to be okay. If you could see where you're going and stay focused on that, everything else is going to be okay. We don't go from distress to despair when you can see the sun. Keep the sun in your eyes. As long as we can see where we're going, we keep plugging along. I think some of you guys have reached the point of despair with some things. You've lost time. You've lost loved ones. You've lost some moments. You've lost your health. You've lost peace. Maybe you've lost some brain cells. I don't know what it is you've lost. But keep your eyes fixed on the sun. And here's where it gets better. I know this is supposed to be an encouraging message, and so here's where it gets better. Here's our hope. I'm not sure what you've lost this morning, but I love what Paul does next. And so pay attention to this. He stands up, kind of like I want to stand up for you this morning, and he says this in verse 21. He says this, no one had eaten for a long time, and finally, Paul called the crew together and said, mind you, he's still a prisoner on this ship. Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. You would have avoided all of this damage and loss in Acts 27:21. And I think for many of the wives in the room, that's a life verse for many of you. You should have listened to me in the first place, you know? It's a life verse for many of you this morning. Could be a clue that Paul was a woman. I don't know. But he goes on and he says this. But so he gets a little, you ever had that in life? It's funny to me that Paul's like, see, I told you so. I told you. You should have listened to me back when I told you to stop and this was getting ugly. So pay attention this morning. 22, verse 22, it says, and I want you to pay attention, I underlined it. But take courage. He stands up in the middle of this storm. Their boat is literally falling apart. They've chucked everything off the edge. They've exhausted everything they know to do. They've done absolutely everything in their own power, and it's still a mess. He stands up and says, but take courage. None of you will lose your life, even though the ship will go down, but take courage. Say it with me, but take courage. I think nobody said it. Take courage this morning. This is where it gets good. In other words, what he's saying is, I can't do a thing about what's happened right here. The circumstances in my life are out of my control. Yeah, I may have caused it, but where it's at right now, I can't do a thing in the world about it. I've done everything I can do with it. I've thrown absolutely everything overboard. I've done absolutely everything I know to do to save my life here, and I can't do a thing in the world about it. But take courage. I can't do anything about the decisions that you made long ago, last month, last night. I don't care where you are spiritually. There's nothing you can do about those decisions that you've made in the past. But take courage. I love that. I would change some things if I could, but I can't. If I got a do-over, but right now, right in this instant, right in this moment, I forget what's behind me and I reach for what's ahead. We serve you know what? What's interesting? We serve a right now God. But take courage. He says, I'll still come for you. My love for you is fierce. I'll still come and get you out. Even though you've made really bad decisions, I'll still come for you. I'll still come and snatch you out of the storm. And Paul keeps going on. And I love the part where he said, you know what? And this is important. I love the part where he says, even though the ship may go down. Don't you love that? Here's a quote. If you hear anything I said this morning, listen to this. If what you care about most is the boat, when the boat goes down, your hope goes down with it. If your hope is in your plan, when your plan is interrupted, your faith fails. Basically, what Paul was saying is we're not going to get there in this boat, which I would prefer, by the way. I would prefer the boat. I like the boat. I'm a fan of the boat. In other words, here's the thing. He's standing up, you know what? Listen, I love the boat. I'd love to stay on the boat. I'd love to keep the boat together. But even if the boat doesn't make it, we're still going to be okay. Your boat might be going down, but keep your courage up. Your bank account might be sinking, but keep your courage up. Your grades might be tanking, but keep your courage up. Your life plans might be a mess, but keep your courage up. Your relationship might be going down in flames, but keep your courage up. Your conditions are not always in your control, and you don't always get to decide what kinds of skies you face or what kind of seas you sail on. God wants to remind us that even when he was walking on the water, that he can borrow our boat from time to time, but he doesn't need our boat. I love that. He created all this. He can get on top of any circumstance in your life. Another scripture, it says, for last night, an angel of the God, to whom I belong, if you look, it goes on, and to whom I serve stood beside me. And he said, don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God, it will be just as it said. We serve an omnidirectional God. God has gone into our future and preserved it. He's come into our past and he's redeemed it, and he's right beside me right now in this moment to comfort and encourage me. And if that doesn't help you, then you're in trouble. I asked the band to come this morning. Here's the thing. I don't know what it is you're going through. I don't know what kind of seas you're sailing on. I have no idea. I know some of you. I actually do know that about some of you. I know exactly what you're going through. I may not be able to empathize with it because I've never been there. But I know some of you this morning are going through junk. Some of you are still wrestling with things. Loss of loved ones. Broken relationships. Financial issues. I don't know what it is. But take courage this morning. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus and on the Son. Here's the thing. Paul made it. They made it to an island. Read the story in Acts chapter 27. It's a cool story. Actually, what was interesting, when they got to the island, some of the people that were taking the centurion and whatever that was guarding the prisoners, they were having a debate on whether to kill the prisoners so they wouldn't run away. Hey, thanks for saving our life, Paul. We might kill you. Here's the thing. It may not happen like we want it to. It might take longer than what you want. It might look different to you than you thought it would. In verse 27, they were shipwrecked on an island. I'm sure that's not what he had in mind. But just like last week when I said, shut up and march and keep marching, some of them, if you read through the end of the story, it's kind of cool. Some of them that couldn't swim, some of them that swam actually jumped in and swam to the island, and then they helped the other ones get off the boat. So this morning I would just tell you, just keep swimming. It will happen. Take courage this morning, church. The right time to do the right thing is right now. So I'm going to ask you to stand this morning. I want you to have courage. I don't know where some of you are. We have these altars up here, and sometimes they get used and sometimes they don't. People are kind of scared of them. I know we're a little bit over time, but I want to just take this moment this morning, give you an opportunity to pray. Give you an opportunity. Maybe you've tried everything. You've been chucking stuff overboard. You've been trying to do everything you can, but you've really never, ever really surrendered your life to Christ. Or maybe you have, and you just need to reiterate that. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for your word and what it teaches us. Help us to keep swimming. God, help us to listen to the voice of reason in our life. Help us to listen for you and what you're telling us, not what all the other voices are saying, not what all the other people are saying. Help us to focus and center on your voice in our life. Help us to hear that. And help us to be obedient. Help us to be willing to be obedient, God. I just pray for our church this morning. Pray, Lord, that even though things that you ask us to do don't make sense sometimes, Lord, help us to persevere. Help us not to care what people think. Help us not to care what others will say about us. But God, make your will clear to us. Help us to trust you with our issues and the storm that's raging and Satan that's trying to destroy us, God. I just pray, Lord, that you would just be with our church this morning. God, I pray if there's somebody here that hasn't made that commitment to follow you, that just like always, I want to give them that opportunity. And Lord, I just ask that they would just pray this prayer. God, forgive me of my sins. Help me to keep you in the center of my life. Help me to focus on what you want for me, even though it doesn't make sense. God, forgive me of my sins. Come into my life. Take control of my life and take direction of my ship. Guide me and direct me in the path that you would want me to go. With every head bowed, if there's anybody that prayed that, just slip your hand up. I want to pray for you. Yep, I see it. Anybody else? I see it. I pray for you this morning. God, thank you so much for those that have raised their hands. God, who have been willing to let you guide their life and are going to listen to you intently this week, that are going to search for you in the Word and what God is telling you to do, and in our hearts that we know is right. Lord, help us to follow that still small voice in our life. God, I thank you so much for our church. I thank you so much for this body of believers. Pray for our community and our country and those that out there that need to hear you. God, help us to take this message and apply it to our lives this week. Your precious holy name, I pray. If you're somebody that asks God in your life for the first time, stop by the Got Questions